The land didn't welcome you. It simply allowed you. That was the first thing Claire noticed as the truck crept down the unpaved road. How the Texas Hill Country didn't reach toward anything, didn't soften itself for arrival. It just sat there, ancient and indifferent, stretching in every direction like something that had given up on being impressed a long time ago. The late afternoon sky burned copper at the edges, bruised purple higher up, and the cedar trees along the fence line stood dark and still as sentinels who had long since stopped caring what they were guarding. She pulled to a stop near the main gate and cut the engine. The silence arrived immediately. Not the city kind of silence, which was really just noise with a lower volume. This was something older. The creak of a weather vane turning half a rotation. The distant low of cattle somewhere beyond the ridge. The wind moving through dry grass with a sound like pages turning in a book no one was reading. Claire checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Lipstick, correct shade, not too much. Hair, loose, approachable, the way the profile listed under ranch-appropriate occasions. Expression, open, warm, practiced into something indistinguishable from genuine. She had done this enough times that preparation felt like armor and armor felt like skin. She reached into the passenger seat and straightened the strap of her bag without looking at it. The truck door opened. Her boot touched Texas soil. She walked toward the gate like she had been here before, like she belonged to this place, like she wasn't a stranger selling the performance of not being one. The bag held a contract, 2 pages initialed at the bottom of each, signed with the name Claire Mercer, which was real, more or less, in the ways that mattered legally. It held 3 other things of note. A small notebook where she logged the particulars of each arrangement. Names, dates, the cover story agreed upon. A phone with a password no one else had ever known, and a ring. The ring lived on her right hand when she was between jobs. Silver band, modest stone, the kind of ring a practical woman buys herself after she stops waiting for someone else to. She would move it to her left hand when she arrived. She always waited until the last possible moment to make that transfer, though she couldn't have explained why, not to anyone, not even to herself in the dark after a long job when the quiet of a hotel room pressed in close. She had been doing this for 2 years, for months, and some number of days she had stopped counting because counting implied she was waiting for something to change. The ad she ran was careful, professional, fastidiously worded. Companion for formal occasions. Presentation ready. Discreet. References available. She had never once used the word bride in the listing. The clients always supplied that word themselves, arriving at it with varying degrees of embarrassment, and she received it each time the same way, neutrally, without reaction, as if it were no different than a job title, which, functionally, it wasn't. The work was clean. That was what she told herself. No one got hurt. No one was deceived who hadn't chosen to be. She showed up. She performed. She left. Whatever warmth she generated in the space between arrival and departure was professional warmth, skilled warmth, the kind that could be packed away with the ring when the contract expired. She was good at it because she had learned, at some cost she did not revisit often, exactly what performed warmth looked like. She had studied it firsthand, up close, for 3 years, from a man who had made it into an art form before she even knew she was in the audience. The ranch house appeared at the end of the drive, low, wide, pale stone, the kind of structure that had been added to rather than rebuilt, that bore the evidence of decades in its rooflines and its mismatched window frames. A porch ran the length of the front. A rocking chair sat at one end, still. Beside the chair, leaning against the post with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, was a man who hadn't moved since she'd turned into the drive and probably hadn't moved for some time before that. His name was Eli Calhoun. She had the basic facts from the intake form. 51 years old, cattle rancher, widower. Daughter's wedding in 3 days at the family property. One guest required on his behalf, to be introduced as a companion of 8 months standing. No further instructions provided. The field marked special requests had been left completely blank, which was unusual. Clients almost always filled it with something, if only the particular lie they most needed sustained. And she had noted the blankness the way you note an unusual silence, as information of a kind. He watched her cross from the truck to the porch with an expression that revealed nothing and suggested that revealing nothing was not an effort for him but simply his natural resting state. He was tall in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors are tall. Not imposing but substantial, built for use rather than presentation, with hands that looked like they had been worked hard since before he'd finished growing into them. He did not come down the steps to meet her. "Claire Mercer," she said, stopping at the base of the porch steps and offering her hand. He looked at it for a beat, not rudely, just as if confirming it was there, and then he took it. His grip was brief and straightforward, no performance in it at all. "Eli," he said. She waited for more. More did not come. "Should I bring my bag inside?" He reached down without a word and took it from her before she'd finished the sentence, which wasn't what she'd meant but was, she supposed, an answer of a kind. He held the door. She walked through. The house smelled like coffee, wood smoke, old leather, and something faintly floral that didn't belong to any of those things and that she couldn't immediately identify. "Guest rooms down the hall," he said. "Dinner's at 6. He set her bag by the hallway entrance and walked back toward the kitchen. She stood in the living room for a moment and looked around. Bookshelves, a stone fireplace, a photograph on the mantel, a woman laughing, head thrown back, shot in the golden light of this exact property. The cedar trees identifiable in the background. The woman in the photograph was beautiful in the unself-conscious way of people who don't think about it. And she was gone. That much was obvious from the way the photograph occupied the space it did, centrally, deliberately, a thing that had been placed rather than landed. Claire moved the ring from her right hand to her left. She did it in the hallway alone the way she always did. She watched him at dinner. This was part of the job, gathering details, learning the texture of a person quickly so that the performance of knowing them over 8 months felt credible. She cataloged. He ate simply, without ceremony. He refilled her water glass without asking. He answered her questions. "How large is the property? How long have you been raising cattle? What's your daughter's name?" With precision and the minimum necessary words, which was not rudeness, she was realizing, but simply the dialect of a man who had spent too much time alone to remember that other people sometimes needed more. His daughter's name was Rosalie. He said it differently than he said everything else. Some small softening in the jaw, almost imperceptible. "She know you hired someone?" Claire asked, not because the answer would change anything, but because she needed to know what story she was walking into. "No," he said. She nodded, adjusted the mental file. Harder than not just convincing strangers, but convincing someone who loved him and knew him well and would be watching. "She'll ask how we met," Claire said. "Feed store," he said without hesitation. 14 months ago. You were buying the wrong kind of mineral block. I told you." She blinked. He had prepared. She hadn't expected that. "That's good," she said, and she meant it. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one, the way a town on a map is in the vicinity of a place you're actually trying to reach. Then it was gone. She asked him about Rosalie's husband-to-be. He talked about the young man with the careful neutrality of a father who had decided to approve of someone on principle before feeling had caught up with the decision. She asked about the other guests. He listed them briefly. She asked, because she had learned to ask things sideways. "Is there anyone I should know about? Anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions?" He looked at her across the table for a moment. "My wife's sister," he said. "Margaret. She doesn't miss much." "Noted," Claire said. He looked at his hands then. They were resting on either side of his plate, and she noticed, for just a moment in the low light of the kitchen, that they were not entirely still. A barely perceptible tremor ran through the right one, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't trained to notice people. She filed it under mystery and said nothing. The next day arrived blue and clear and cold at the edges. She had assumed she'd spend the 3 pre-wedding days in careful, professional proximity, the sort of managed closeness that looked easy from the outside and required considerable internal maintenance. She had not assumed she'd spend the first morning helping repair a section of fence on the eastern pasture because the ranch hand had called in sick and the cattle needed to be kept from the road. She didn't offer. He didn't ask. He simply appeared at the kitchen door with gloves and said, "You'll want boots if you have them," and something in the matter-of-fact delivery of it, the assumption that she was capable, not the hedged, polite requests she usually got from clients who treated her like a decorative object, made her pull on her boots without comment and follow him out. The work was harder than it looked and more satisfying than she expected. He showed her how to hold the wire without telling her she couldn't do it. She pulled her weight. He noticed and did not make a production of noticing, which was somehow the most respectful version of acknowledgement. By mid-morning they had settled into a rhythm, quiet, functional, the kind that develops between people who are both competent and uninterested in performance. She found herself, at one point, simply working without thinking about how she looked while working, which was strange enough to register. "You've done this before," he said, not a question. "Grew up near farmland," she said. "West of Abilene." He nodded as if this explained something he hadn't needed explained but that now fit into place. They ate lunch on the tailgate of his truck. Sandwiches she'd assembled from what she found in the kitchen, because she'd found herself in the kitchen before he'd come looking and had simply made them. He accepted his without comment, which she had come to understand was his version of thank you. They ate looking out at the pasture. A hawk made long, lazy circles above the ridge. "She looks like her," Claire said, without planning to, nodding toward the distant treeline and meaning something else entirely. Meaning the photograph on the mantel, meaning Rosalie, meaning the way the girl in the one photo she'd found in the hallway had her mother's particular angle of chin. Eli was quiet for a long moment. "She does," he said. Something inside her shifted, slightly and against her will, the way a door shifts in a frame when the wind changes. She laughed, later, genuinely, at something he said that was dry and unexpected and delivered with a perfectly flat expression. And the laugh surprised her enough that she pressed her hand briefly over her mouth as if catching it. He watched this happen with something careful and private in his eyes that she didn't let herself examine too closely. She moved the ring back to her right hand that night, alone in the guest room, then moved it back to her left. She did this 3 times before she set it on the nightstand and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling. He arrived on the afternoon of the second day. She saw the car from the kitchen window before she heard it. A rental, expensive but trying not to look it, which was a distinction that told you everything about the person inside. Her hands went still on the counter. Her body knew before her mind finished the recognition. Derek. She had not told anyone from her previous life what she did now. She had constructed careful distance between that chapter and this one. He should not have known where she was. He stepped out of the car and looked at the house with the survey of a man who appraises things before he approaches them, which was how he had always approached everything, including her initially before he'd decided she was worth the closer look. She walked outside. She did this deliberately, choosing to meet the thing rather than wait for it to reach her, which was the only useful thing the last 3 years had taught her. "How did you find me?" she said. Not a question. A statement she wanted the answer to anyway. He smiled, that particular smile, the one she had once found charming and later understood was simply the expression of a man who is never genuinely surprised by his own audacity. "Friend of a client. Small world." She kept her voice even professional the way she kept everything. "You need to leave. I just want to talk." "There is nothing." "Claire." The way he said her name, proprietorial, slightly patient, the way you speak to someone you have categorized as yours even after the category has been formally dissolved, made her jaw tighten. She didn't hear Eli approach. He moved quietly for a man of his size. He simply materialized beside her, not in front of her, not between them in the way that would have made it about him, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, one thumb hooked in his belt and his expression carrying the particular blankness of a man who has decided to be present and is waiting to see whether more will be required of him. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at her for explanation. He just stood there. Derek looked at Eli. Eli looked at Derek. Something passed between them that did not require translation. The kind of thing communicated in posture and stillness and the quiet certainty of a man on his own land. Derek left. Claire stood very still for a moment after the rental car disappeared down the drive. She was aware of Eli still beside her. She was aware of the particular quality of the silence. "Thank you," she said. He said, and walked back toward the barn. She stood there another moment alone on the drive and did something she had not done in 2 years, for months, and the number of days she'd stopped counting. She felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, not with drama, but the way a window opens in a room that has been closed too long, and the air that comes in is so ordinary and so necessary that you're embarrassed it ever seemed complicated. The rehearsal dinner was held in the barn, which had been transformed by Rosalie and her bridesmaids with string lights and wildflowers, and the enthusiasm of women who had planned something and were now getting to have it. It was beautiful in the unpretentious way of things made by people who didn't need to be impressive, just honest. Claire wore blue. She had chosen it carefully, not conspicuous, not too quiet. She stood beside Eli through the early part of the evening and watched him navigate the attention of relatives and neighbors with the stoic goodwill of a man who endures social occasions rather than inhabits them. She covered for him when conversation required warmth he wasn't producing. He, without being asked, steered them away from a prolonged conversation with Margaret, Rosalie's mother's sister, sharp-eyed, methodical, when he sensed Claire's footing getting uncertain. They worked together, she realized somewhere in the second hour, like people who had been practicing. Then Derek reappeared. She didn't know how he'd gotten the address, didn't know which of Rosalie's groom's connections had offered the venue information. Didn't matter. He was there, at the edge of the barn, drink in hand, eyes finding her across the room with the practiced ease of someone who has always counted on being found tolerable in social situations. She felt the evening tilt. He worked his way toward her. She saw it coming and couldn't find a graceful exit. He arrived with the specific confidence of a man about to renegotiate terms he'd already lost. He introduced himself to Eli, to the couple standing near them, with a version of their shared history that was technically accurate and constructed in such a way as to make her seem like someone still in the process of moving on. She felt the floor of her composure going soft. And then Eli spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform outrage. He set his hand against the small of her back, one hand, steady, warm through the fabric of her dress, and he said to Derek, with the same quiet certainty with which he must have told stubborn cattle where they were and were not going, "She doesn't have anything that belongs to you, and she's got somewhere to be tonight. So do you." That was all. Derek processed this, made a brief calculation, left. Claire excused herself with a murmured something about fresh air. She walked out of the barn into the cold blue dark of the Texas night, and she stood with her hands pressed flat against the wooden fence and breathed, once, twice, until she could trust her face again. She could not afford this. That was the only clear thought. She could not afford what was happening to her here. He found her in the barn later, after the dinner had wound down and the guests had drifted toward the main house. He came in the side door and didn't turn on the overhead lights, and so they were left in the low illumination of the string lights someone had strung along the rafters, the warm amber of it falling over the hay and the horse stalls and the dust motes drifting through the air. He sat on a hay bale a few feet from where she was standing. Didn't invite her to sit. Just sat there, in the comfortable way of someone who has made peace with silence. She spoke first, eventually, because the quiet between them had stopped being something she could maintain. "Why did you really hire me?" she asked. He was quiet for so long she thought she'd overstepped. "My wife," he said, "before she passed. She made me promise I wouldn't go to Rosalie's wedding alone." He looked at the ground. "She knew me well enough to know I'd otherwise find a reason not to go at all." A long pause. "She wanted me to remember how to be around people." Claire looked at him. "I tried asking someone real," he said. "But that was worse, because then there was expectation, and I wasn't ready for that." He stopped, turned the brim of his hat in his hands, a small restless motion. "I thought if I paid someone she could just be there, and I could keep the promise, and nobody would have to." He didn't finish. "Feel anything," Claire said. He looked at her. "Yeah." She sat down on the hay bale next to him. Not close. Just there, in the same space in the amber light. "My name isn't really Claire Mercer," she said. "It's Claire Merritt. I changed it because I had a life before this, and the person I was in it is someone I needed some distance from." She looked at her hands. "I started doing this because it was safe. You don't get hurt if the terms are clear. If everyone knows what they're paying for and what they're getting." She turned the ring on her left hand. "I got good at not being real. It turns out that's a skill that has a market." He said nothing for a while. "You're real," he said finally. Just that. Plainly, in the same register he'd said everything else, as if it were a simple fact that didn't require dressing up. She looked at the string lights for a long time. That's the problem, she said. She was packed and ready by 7 the next morning. The wedding was at 4. She had outlined this to herself as she folded her dress and placed the gift from both of their names on the hall table. She would attend the ceremony. She would stand beside him through the reception. She would see Rosalie's face when Eli danced with her, and then she would come back to the house and collect her bag and drive out the way she'd come in, and the land would allow her departure the same way it had allowed her arrival, without comment, without ceremony. The contract would be fulfilled. The job would be clean. She was in the kitchen at 7:15, bag by the door, drinking the last of the coffee, when she heard his boots on the porch. He came inside and stopped when he saw the bag. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not say, "Don't go." He was not the kind of man who commanded things from people. She had learned that much. He said, "The ceremony's not until 4. "I know," she said. He was quiet. She could hear the ranch coming to life around them. Birds, the distant sound of cattle, the creak of the weather vane. "What would it cost?" he said carefully, slowly, as if he had been composing this sentence for some time. "For you to stay here as yourself?" She looked at him. "Not a client," he said. "Not a contract. Just stay. As whoever that is." She didn't answer for a long moment. She put her coffee mug down on the counter. "I don't have a price for that," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. He looked at her with those careful eyes, and he nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he already suspected. "All right," he said. He walked to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup. Then he turned and looked at her and said, "Rosalie makes eggs on the morning of big occasions. She's been doing it since she was 12. She'll be here in an hour." He said it the way you tell someone a thing they should know about a family they might want to be part of, which was not a proposal and not a declaration, which was simply what it was: Eli Calhoun saying everything by barely saying anything. Claire Merritt stood in the kitchen of a ranch house in the Texas Hill Country and did not pick up her bag. She stood beside him at the altar's edge when Rosalie walked down the aisle in the afternoon light, and she watched his face. The thing that moved across it, the grief and love so tangled together they had stopped being distinguishable, and she did not look away from it the way she would have looked away from something she wasn't meant to see. She let herself see it. After, in the long golden hour of the reception, she found him standing at the edge of the property where the cedar trees began, looking out at the land that had held his family and his loss and his decades of solitary endurance. She went and stood beside him, not performing anything, not calculating the correct warmth to emit, just there. She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the ring. She turned it over once in her fingers. The silver band, the modest stone, the thing she had used as a prop for 2 years, for months, and the number of days she had finally, that morning, stopped counting. She placed it in his palm, not on a finger, not as a declaration, but as what it was: a surrender, a retirement, the closing of a contract she had never meant to take out on herself. He looked down at it. Then he folded his fingers around it and slid it into his shirt pocket, close to the chest, the way you keep something you intend to hold on to. The ranch glowed around them. The sky ran out of gold and began its slow turn toward the first dark blue of evening. Somewhere behind them, music started, something slow, the kind you don't need to know how to dance to, just the kind you sway to, just barely, just enough. She was not for hire anymore. And the cowboy who had hired her had gotten something he had not put in the contract, had not known to ask for, had not believed. Even in the hopeful quiet of the night he'd placed the ad, was still a thing available in the world. Someone real, standing right beside him, in the land that didn't welcome you, that simply, at last, allowed you to stay.